The scratching started on the third day. Jack Callahan had bought the house for its silence. It sat on 3 acres of forgotten land, bordered by a dense stand of pines that swallowed sound and a creek that offered a steady, soothing whisper. It was a place to forget the noise, the shouting, the ringing in his ears that never truly went away. He was a former Navy SEAL, a man whose resume was written in sand and blood, and all he wanted now was the quiet. But the scratching defied the quiet. Kaiser, his German shepherd, was the source. The dog was a veteran, too, a retired military working dog who had saved Jack's life twice in the dust-choked alleys of places best left unnamed. Kaiser was disciplined, silent, a shadow of lethal loyalty. He did not whine. He did not bark without reason. He did not scratch at doors. Yet there he was, day after day, his powerful front paws working methodically at the base of a single door at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was a small, unassuming door, painted the same sterile white as the rest of the house. It was locked. The realtor had mentioned it was an old owner's closet, the key long lost. Probably full of junk, she'd said with a dismissive wave. Jack had tried to ignore it. He'd tried to command Kaiser away. The dog would obey. His amber eyes filled with a conflict Jack understood, the clash between duty to his handler and a deeper, more primal instinct. But the moment Jack turned his back, Kaiser would return. The soft, insistent scrape of claw on wood would resume, a maddening metronome counting down to something Jack didn't want to find. For weeks, the ritual continued. Jack would wake, drink his coffee in the pre-dawn gray, and listen. Scratch. Scrape. A low, guttural whine would sometimes escape the dog's throat, a sound of profound distress. Jack found himself staring at the door. He ran his hand over the cheap brass knob. It was cold, firm, unyielding. He knew something was wrong. You don't spend a decade hunting monsters in the dark without learning to recognize their scent, even when it's faint. This house, this quiet place he had chosen for his peace, was not at peace. One morning, the scratching was frantic. Kaiser was digging now, splintering the cheap wood of the doorframe. That was it. Jack went to his workshop, the place where he painstakingly repaired old furniture, trying to mend things that were broken. He returned with a pry bar and a hammer. "All right, boy," he murmured, resting a hand on Kaiser's powerful neck. "Let's see what has you so spooked." The lock was cheap, but the door was sturdy. It took 3 solid hits with the hammer against the pry bar before the jamb groaned, splintered, and gave way. The door swung inward with a sigh of stale air. The room was not a closet. It was small, barely 6 feet by 8. There was no window. The walls were covered in thick, sound-dampening foam, the kind you'd find in a recording studio. But this was no studio. A single bare bulb hung from a wire in the ceiling. On the floor was a thin, stained mattress. In one corner, a plastic bucket. But it was the wall opposite the door that held his attention. Scratched into the plaster, beneath the foam that had been partially torn away, were words. Hundreds of them. A frantic diary etched with a fingernail or perhaps a small stone. And dates. A calendar of terror, with days crossed out one by one. Kaiser pushed past him, his nose to the ground. He went straight to the mattress and began to whine, a heartbroken, keening sound that vibrated through the floorboards and up Jack's spine. Jack knelt. He saw the faint, dark stains on the fabric. He smelled the lingering odor of fear and bleach. His eyes went back to the wall. To the last entry, dated 6 months prior. He says no one will ever believe me. He says my father is weak. He says Mr. Thorne owns this town. He says I am nothing. I am not nothing. My name is Sarah. I am 17. Please, someone, help me." Jack stood slowly. The quiet he had sought was a lie. It was not peace. It was the silence of a grave. The ringing in his ears grew louder, a familiar prelude to the cold, controlled rage that had been his closest companion for years. He looked at Kaiser, who now sat sentinel beside the mattress, his gaze fixed on Jack. The dog knew. He had known all along. "Okay, boy," Jack said, his voice a low gravel. "We're going to help her." The promise was made, not to a ghost on a wall, but to the memory of a girl's desperate plea. It was a promise he intended to keep. He started with the town records office. The previous owner was a man named David Miller. He had a daughter, Sarah Miller. A quick search of the local newspaper archives brought up a small, buried article. Local man dies in tragic hunting accident. David Miller died 6 months ago. The article mentioned he was survived by his daughter, Sarah, who had since moved in with her aunt in the neighboring town. The name from the wall echoed in his mind. Mr. Thorne owns this town. Jack found him easily. Marcus Thorne. Real estate mogul, philanthropist, the man whose name was on the library, the park, the new wing of the hospital. He was untouchable, the smiling patriarch of the community. His son, Julian Thorne, was a local golden boy, quarterback, honor roll. A face that was all teeth and entitlement. Jack drove to the next town over. He found the aunt's house, a modest clapboard home with a struggling garden out front. He parked across the street and watched. For 2 hours, he just sat, his eyes scanning, observing, falling back into the old rhythms of surveillance. Finally, the front door opened. A girl stepped out to get the mail. She was thin, with haunted eyes that seemed too large for her face. She moved with a permanent flinch, as if expecting a blow at any moment. It was Sarah. He got out of the car. He didn't approach her directly, but walked down the sidewalk, Kaiser at his heel. As he drew near, her eyes widened, not at him but at the dog. A flicker of something, recognition, fear, sorrow, crossed her face. "He's a good dog," Jack said, his voice calm, even. She stared at Kaiser, who sat patiently, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the pavement. I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We had one that looked just like him. His name was General." Jack's blood ran cold. He remembered the realtor mentioning the previous owner had to give up his dog after the accident. No doubt it was sent to a shelter, or worse. "My name is Jack Callahan," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "I live in your old house now." Her face went pale. The fear was back, stark and overwhelming. She took a step back, her hand clutching the mail so tightly her knuckles were white. "I found the room," he said softly. "I read what you wrote." A strangled sob escaped her lips. Her eyes darted around, up and down the quiet suburban street, as if expecting monsters to leap from behind the manicured hedges. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "You can't. He'll know. He'll find me." "Who?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. "Julian." She breathed the name like a curse. "Julian Thorne." Jack held her gaze. He saw the terror there, the learned helplessness of a victim who had been told over and over that she was powerless. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of villagers huddled in the ruins of their homes. "This ends now," he said. The words were not loud, but they carried the weight of an oath. "I promise you." She just stared at him, tears streaming down her face, unsure if he was a savior or just another man making a promise that would be broken. He gave her a small, folded piece of paper. On it was his phone number. "If you need anything, anything at all, you call this number." He turned and walked away, Kaiser falling into step beside him. He did not look back. He had made a promise. The mission had begun. The first call came 2 days later. It was not from Sarah. It was from a slick, confident voice that oozed expensive law school and moral decay. "Mr. Callahan, my name is Arthur Vance. I represent the Thorne family." Jack stood in his kitchen, looking out the window at the pines. "I'm not interested." A condescending chuckle crackled through the phone. "Oh, I think you will be. My client, Mr. Marcus Thorne, understands there may have been some misunderstanding regarding your recent purchase. He is prepared to offer you a generous sum to compensate you for any inconvenience and to assist in your relocation. Let's say double what you paid for the property." It was a bribe, a clean, simple, corporate bribe to make the problem go away. "The house is not for sale," Jack said flatly. The lawyer's tone hardened. "Mr. Callahan, you seem like an intelligent man. You're new here. Perhaps you don't understand how things work in this community. It would be in your best interest, and the best interest of that troubled young girl you spoke to accept this offer and move on." There it was. The threat, wrapped in silk. Jack let the silence hang for a moment. He thought of the words scratched into the wall. He thought of the fear in Sarah's eyes. "Here's what you don't understand," Jack said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a tone that men who knew him had learned to fear. "I don't care how things work in this community. You tell Marcus Thorne that his money is worthless, and you tell him that if he or his son go anywhere near Sarah Miller again, his world is going to come apart at the seams. I am not a problem he can buy. I am a promise he can't break." He hung up the phone before the lawyer could respond. The war had been declared. His first stop was the local police department. The building was small, trying for quaint but landing on neglected. The officer at the desk, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his uniform, looked at Jack with bored indifference. Jack explained the situation calmly, factually. The locked room, the writing on the wall, his conversation with Sarah Miller. He left out the threat from Thorne's lawyer for now. He was testing the waters. The officer, whose name tag read Sergeant Miller, no relation, Jack hoped, typed lazily into a computer. He sighed. "Look, sir," he said, not making eye contact. "We investigated David Miller's death. It was a tragic accident. The girl, Sarah, was distraught. Kids make up stories. She was probably just looking for attention. She was locked in a room for weeks," Jack stated, his voice level. The sergeant finally looked up, his eyes cold. "And you got that from some scratches on a wall in a house you just bought? We don't open investigations based on vandalism." He pushed a form across the counter. "If you want to file a report, you can fill this out. It'll go in the system." It was a dismissal, a clear, unequivocal message. "This door is closed." Jack took the form. He knew it would end up in a trash can the moment he walked out. He had his answer. The corruption wasn't just at the top. It ran through the foundation. The harassment started that night. A pair of headlights appeared at the end of his long driveway, staying there for hours, an unblinking yellow eye in the darkness. Jack watched from a darkened window, Kaiser a low growl at his side. They were watching him, trying to intimidate him. It was amateurish, but it was a message. "We know where you live. The next day, his trash cans were gone. Not emptied, gone. A petty act of annoyance. Then came the whispers in town. When he went to the hardware store, the friendly clerk from the week before suddenly couldn't meet his eye. Conversations stopped when he walked down an aisle. He was being painted as an outsider, a troublemaker. A few days later, he found a dead squirrel on his front porch. Its neck had been snapped. It was a crude, ugly warning, a symbol of what happened to small, helpless things that got in the way. Jack buried the animal under the pines. He did not feel fear. He felt a familiar, cold resolve settling deep in his bones. They thought these were signs of strength. He knew they were signs of desperation. They were making noise because they were afraid of the quiet man who had stumbled upon their secret. The campaign escalated. He drove to see Sarah just to check in. As he pulled onto her aunt's street, he saw Julian Thorne's expensive sports car parked 2 houses down. Julian was leaning against it with 2 of his friends, laughing, staring directly at Sarah's front door. It was a siege, a constant psychological pressure to remind her she was never safe. Jack parked his truck directly behind Julian's car, blocking him in. He got out, Kaiser at his side. Julian's smile faded, replaced by an arrogant sneer. Well, well, look what we have here, the stray's new bodyguard. Jack ignored him. He walked to the front door and knocked. Sarah's aunt, a tired-looking woman with fear etched around her eyes, opened it a crack. "Is Sarah okay?" Jack asked. "They've been out there all day," the woman whispered. "The police won't do anything." "I'll handle it," Jack said. He turned and walked back towards his truck. Julian stepped forward, blocking his path. He was taller than Jack, puffed up with the unearned confidence of a boy who had never been told no. "You need to learn your place, old man. This doesn't concern you." "Move your car," Jack said, his voice quiet. Julian laughed. "Or what? You gonna call a cop?" "Oh, wait. They work for my dad." One of his friends snickered and took a step forward. It was a classic pincer movement, sloppy and predictable. The friend reached out to shove Jack. It was over before it started. Jack moved with an economy of motion that was brutally efficient. He sidestepped the shove, used the man's momentum against him, and spun him around, locking his arm behind his back in a hold that brought a yelp of pain. In the same fluid motion, he stepped towards Julian, who was frozen in shock. Jack didn't hit him. He didn't have to. He simply placed his hand on Julian's chest. "I'm only going to say this once," Jack said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Get in your car. Leave this street. And if I ever see you or your friends near her again, the next conversation we have will be significantly less pleasant." He applied a fraction of pressure to the arm of the man he was holding, and a sharp crack echoed in the quiet street as the wrist broke. The man screamed. Jack released him. He looked Julian dead in the eye. "Go." Julian scrambled backward, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. He and his other friend helped the injured one into the car and sped away, tires squealing. Jack stood there for a moment, the adrenaline slowly receding. He had crossed a line. He had engaged directly. Now they knew what he was, but he also knew he couldn't win this war alone. They owned the system. He needed to build his own. That night, he made a phone call he hadn't made in 2 years. He dialed a number he knew from memory. It was answered on the first ring. "Yeah." The voice was gruff. No nonsense. "Reaper, it's Nomad," Jack said, using their old call signs. There was a pause on the other end, then a low chuckle. "Nomad. I figured you were dead or on a beach somewhere. Don't tell me you're bored." "I need a favor," Jack said. "A big one. I've stepped on something ugly. Where are you? Reaper asked, all business now. Small town in New Hampshire. It's quiet. Doesn't sound quiet, Reaper said. How many do you need? Just you and Ghost, and bring the kit, the cleanup kit. We're on our way, Reaper said, and the line went dead. Jack hung up the phone. The cavalry was coming. 2 days later, a beat-up contractor's van pulled into Jack's driveway. 2 men got out. The first, Reaper, was built like a blacksmith, with a thick beard and arms covered in faded tattoos. The second, Ghost, was leaner, quieter, his eyes constantly moving, taking in every detail. They were his brothers, men he had trusted with his life countless times. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. They walked into the house, dropped their bags, and Reaper looked at Jack. Situation brief. Jack laid it all out. The house, the room, Sarah, the thorns, the corrupt police, the confrontation. Ghost listened in silence, his fingers tapping a silent rhythm on his knee. When Jack was finished, Reaper let out a low whistle. Small town, huh? He said with a grim smile. You always did know how to pick a vacation spot. They're arrogant, Ghost said, his first words. They feel safe. That's a mistake. So what's the play? Reaper asked. We dismantle them, Jack said. Piece by piece. We can't use the system, so we build our own case. We find the evidence, we find other victims, and we find a way to make it so public they can't bury it. Their first move was to find allies on the ground. Ghost, their tech and surveillance expert, quickly found what he was looking for. Maria Sanchez, an investigative reporter for a small, independent online news outlet. For 2 years, she had been writing articles about Marcus Thorne's questionable business dealings, skirting the edges of libel, hinting at a darker story no one would corroborate. She was a dog with a bone. Jack met her in a diner 50 miles away. She was sharp, cautious, her eyes assessing him over her coffee cup. I read your articles on Thorne, Jack began. You think he's dirty. I know he's dirty, she corrected. Proving it is the hard part. People are scared. He owns everything. Mortgages, jobs, the town council. You come at the king. You best not miss. I have a witness, Jack said. A victim. But her word isn't enough. They've already painted her as unstable. Maria leaned forward, her interest piqued. What kind of victim? Jack told her about Sarah. He didn't give her all the details, just enough. He saw the fire ignite in her eyes. This was the story she had been waiting for. If you can protect her, and if you can bring me concrete evidence, I can get it out there, she said. I have a national contact who owes me a favor. We can bypass the local media blackout. They had their voice. Now they needed a weapon for the legal fight that was sure to come. Jack made another call, this time to a number Reaper had given him. He asked for Bulldog. Benjamin Carter, Bulldog Benning to his clients, was a former JAG officer who now ran a pro bono practice for veterans. He was loud, profane, and utterly brilliant. He met them at Jack's house, walking right past the no trespassing sign, as if it were a welcome mat. He listened to the story, pacing the living room, a storm of righteous fury gathering on his face. A rich man's kid and a bought and paid for police department? He boomed. That's my bread and butter. I'll tear them apart on the stand. But, he stopped and pointed a thick finger at Jack. I need something to swing. Witness testimony is a start, but juries like paper. They like recordings. They like pictures. Get me a smoking gun, and I'll get you a conviction. The team was assembled. The warrior, the spy, the journalist, and the lawyer. Their next task was the hardest: finding other victims. Maria's old research gave them a starting point. A handful of lawsuits against Thorne's companies that had been settled out of court with ironclad non-disclosure agreements. A former employee who sued for wrongful termination. A business partner who claimed he was cheated. Reaper and Jack paid them a visit. They didn't threaten. They didn't intimidate. They offered something else. They offered protection. To a woman who had been harassed out of her job, Jack said, "You're not alone anymore. We stand with you." To a man whose business had been ruined, he said, "They only have power because everyone is afraid. We are not afraid." Slowly, cautiously, the dam of fear began to crack. One person agreed to talk, on the condition of anonymity. Then another. They told stories of blackmail, threats, financial ruin. A pattern emerged. Marcus Thorne didn't just bend the rules, he rewrote them, and anyone who objected was crushed. But there was still no direct evidence linking him or Julian to violent crimes, besides Sarah's story. They needed more. The key, Jack knew, was in the house. In that room. Thorne was arrogant. He and his son probably thought they had cleaned up perfectly. Ghost went to work. He swept the room with equipment Jack hadn't seen since his days in the field. Black lights, chemical sniffers, thermal imagers. For a day, he found nothing. The room was clean. Too clean. The bleach smell was faint, but it was everywhere. And then he found it. "Nomad?" Ghost called from upstairs. His voice was tight. "You need to see this." Jack and Reaper went up. Ghost was pointing at a small, innocuous-looking electrical outlet on the wall. "It's a dummy," Ghost said. He used a delicate tool to pry the cover off. Behind it, nestled in the wall cavity, was a small, high-definition spy camera, its lens no bigger than a pinhole. It was wired for power directly into the house's electrical system. "He filmed it," Reaper breathed, his voice laced with disgust. "The camera is dead," Ghost said, examining it. "But it likely streamed to a local server, a laptop, a hard drive, somewhere he could watch it." "Julian's house," Jack said immediately. "Or his dorm room at college. He'd want to keep it close." The mission parameters had changed. This was no longer just a protection detail. It was a recovery operation. They needed to get that footage. But Thorne was getting nervous. The pressure was building. He must have heard whispers that people were starting to talk. He decided to do what he always did when faced with a problem he couldn't buy. He decided to erase it. The attack came without warning. Sarah was staying with her aunt, under the discreet watch of Reaper, who was parked in the contractor's van down the street. Jack and Ghost were back at the house, planning the data heist. Two men, professionals by the look of them, kicked in the aunt's front door. They weren't Julian's loud-mouthed friends. These were hired thugs, silent and brutal. Reaper was on them in seconds, but one was already inside. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't cower. Months of living in terror followed. Jack and Ghost arrived minutes later, their truck screaming to a halt. Jack ran inside. He saw Sarah on the floor, conscious but dazed, a massive bruise already forming on her cheek. He saw the defeated thug being tied up by Reaper. He saw the fear back in her aunt's eyes. He knelt beside Sarah. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. She looked at him, and through the pain, he saw a fire he hadn't seen before. "I got him," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I fought back." She opened her hand. Under her fingernails were traces of skin and blood. The thug's DNA. Jack looked from her bruised face to the man on the floor. He looked at the syringe that had fallen from the man's hand. They weren't trying to scare her. They were trying to kill her. to make it look like an overdose, a tragic end for a troubled girl. Something inside Jack, a wire that had been stretched taut for years, finally snapped. The cold, controlled rage gave way to an Arctic certainty. He had tried to play by a set of rules. He had tried to build a case. He had tried to give the system a chance to work. The system was broken. The rules were gone. He stood up and looked at his team. Ghost, get the recording of Reaper's comms from the fight. Maria needs to hear it. Reaper, get our friend here to a secure location. Find out who hired him. Bulldog needs a confession. He turned back and looked out the window in the direction of the Thorne mansion that sat on a hill overlooking the town. I'm going to the source, he said, his voice flat and deadly. We end this tonight. The plan was simple, audacious. Ghost located the likely server for the camera's feed, a private computer in Julian Thorne's bedroom at the family estate. Getting to it was the problem. The Thorne mansion was a fortress, complete with private security, cameras, and motion sensors. A frontal assault was out. They needed a distraction. That's where Maria came in, armed with the audio from Reaper's fight and the sworn affidavit from the now cooperative hired muscle. She made her call. Within an hour, a news van from a national network was on its way. Bulldog Benning, meanwhile, filed an emergency injunction and a request for a warrant with the one state judge he knew Thorne couldn't touch. The evidence was thin for a warrant, but the confession about the attempted murder was enough to get the ball rolling. The takedown was timed to the second. At 9 p.m., Maria's story broke online. A bombshell report titled Fear in the Granite State, the Thorne Empire's Wall of Silence. It detailed the attack on Sarah, complete with the hired thug's confession, naming Julian Thorne as the one who paid him. At the same time, Jack and Ghost, clad in black, moved through the woods bordering the Thorne estate. Ghost, on a small tablet, guided Jack, disabling security cameras one by one. Reaper, positioned on a ridge a mile away, watched through a high-powered scope, feeding them information on the security patrols. As the news story spread like wildfire through the town's social media, Marcus Thorne's phone began to ring off the hook. He was at a charity gala he was hosting at his mansion, the pinnacle of his public image. He stepped away from the party, his face a mask of fury, barking orders into his phone. He was distracted. His security was distracted. That was their window. Jack scaled a stone wall and dropped silently into the manicured gardens. Ghost followed. They moved from shadow to shadow, ghosts in the night, reaching the side of the house, a second-story window, Julian's bedroom. 2 minutes, Ghost whispered. He pulled a device from his pack, placed it on the glass, and a perfect circle was cut without a sound. Jack was inside in a heartbeat. The room was exactly what he expected, a monument to unearned arrogance, trophies, expensive electronics, clothes strewn everywhere. He went straight to the computer. Ghost followed, plugging a small device into the tower. Cloning the drive, Ghost said. This will take a few minutes. Downstairs, the party was dissolving into chaos. Guests were murmuring, looking at their phones. Marcus Thorne's carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. He ordered his security to lock the gates, to keep the press out. Suddenly, the flashing lights of state police cruisers appeared at the end of the long driveway. The incorruptible cop Jack had suspected existed, a state trooper named Evans whom Bulldog had contacted, was at the front of the column, warrant in hand. "We're out of time," Jack said. The progress bar on Ghost's tablet was at 90%. Footsteps pounded up the stairs. Julian Thorne burst into the room, his face pale with panic. He saw the two men in black, the device attached to his computer, and his eyes went wide with terror. He didn't scream. He lunged for a baseball bat leaning against the wall. Jack met him halfway. It wasn't a fight. It was a dismissal. A single, precise movement, and Julian was on the floor, gasping for air, the bat clattering uselessly beside him. "Done!" Ghost said, yanking the drive. They were out the window and gone before Julian could even get to his feet. They met Reaper at the rendezvous point. Jack took the drive from Ghost. "Get Sarah and her aunt somewhere safe. Go." Jack didn't run. He walked back towards the mansion. He walked through the front gate, past the confused security guards, and into the grand ballroom where the party had been. Marcus Thorne was there, surrounded by his lawyers, screaming at Trooper Evans. He saw Jack walk in, and his face contorted with pure, undiluted hatred. "You!" he snarled. "You're finished! I will bury you!" Jack walked calmly to the stage, where a large projection screen was set up to show a slideshow of Thorne's charitable donations. He took the hard drive from his pocket and handed it to the stunned AV technician. "Play it," Jack said. It was not a request. The technician, a young kid caught in the crossfire, fumbled with the cables. "Don't you dare!" Thorne roared. But it was too late. The screen flickered, and the slideshow was replaced by a video. The view was from a low angle, from a hidden camera. It showed the inside of the small, soundproofed room. It showed Sarah, younger, terrified. And it showed Julian Thorne, his face clear as day, his voice full of cruel laughter. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The whispers stopped. The entire room was frozen in horrified silence. The video was undeniable. It was monstrous. Marcus Thorne stared at the screen, his face ashen. The illusion of power, the empire he had built on fear and money, evaporated in the harsh glow of the projector. He was just a man, the father of a monster, exposed for all to see. Trooper Evans stepped forward. "Marcus Thorne, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to kidnapping." He nodded to another officer. "Julian Thorne is upstairs. Take him into custody." As they put the cuffs on him, Thorne's eyes found Jack's across the room. There was no defiance left in them, only the hollow look of utter defeat. Jack turned and walked out. He didn't look back. The noise was finally over. The quiet was returning. The trials were swift. The digital evidence was irrefutable. The testimony from the other victims Bulldog had found created a tidal wave of public opinion against the Thornes. Julian Thorne was sentenced to life in prison. Marcus Thorne received 30 years for his role in the cover-up and for a host of financial crimes that Maria's continued reporting had uncovered. The corrupt police sergeant and a handful of town officials were also indicted. The system, once prodded with overwhelming force, had finally been forced to work. Justice was absolute. A few weeks later, as Jack was replacing the splintered doorframe on the small upstairs room, a car pulled into his driveway. It was Trooper Evans. "Just wanted to come by and say thank you," Evans said, standing on the porch. "We knew Thorne was dirty for years, could never make anything stick. You did in a month what we couldn't do in a decade." "You're the one who served the warrant," Jack replied. "You did your job when it counted." Evans nodded. "There's something else. When we processed Julian's things, we found a journal. He wrote about Sarah's dog, General. He didn't just send him to a shelter. He bragged about abandoning him in the state forest, miles from anywhere." Jack's jaw tightened. "We've had patrols looking," Evans said, "but it's been months. Chances are slim." After the trooper left, Jack stood there for a long time. He looked at Kaiser, who sat beside him, a silent, steady presence. He had a new mission. He and Kaiser spent the next 3 weekends searching the vast state forest. Jack used all his old tracking skills, looking for any sign. On the third Sunday, deep in a part of the woods rarely visited by hikers, Kaiser suddenly went rigid. He let out a low bark and bolted through the undergrowth. Jack followed. He found Kaiser at the entrance to a small, shallow cave, and inside, curled up, emaciated but alive, was another German shepherd. He was old, his fur matted, but his eyes were intelligent and kind. A faded collar was still around his neck. The tag read General. The reunion between Sarah and her old friend was a thing of quiet, heartbreaking beauty. The dog, weak as he was, seemed to find a new strength, thumping his tail and licking the tears from her face. It was another piece of her life, stolen by the thorns, now returned. Jack found his new purpose not in war, but in healing. He partnered with a local veterinarian and started a nonprofit. They rescued abandoned animals, focusing on German shepherds, and trained them to be service dogs for veterans suffering from trauma. Kaiser, the stoic warrior, became the lead trainer, his calm demeanor and unwavering loyalty a perfect model for the other dogs. He was no longer just a weapon. He was a healer. The small room upstairs was no longer a prison. Jack had taken down the foam, repaired the walls, and put in a large window that looked out over the pines. It was his office now, a place of peace. One cool autumn evening, the work was done. The last of the equipment was put away. Jack sat on his front porch, a cup of coffee in his hands. Sarah was there, sitting in the rocking chair beside him. She was enrolled in college now, studying to be a victim's advocate. The haunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet strength that Jack knew would change the world for the better. At their feet, 2 German shepherds lay side by side, Kaiser and General. 2 old soldiers, finally at peace. The sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The only sounds were the whisper of the creek and the gentle creak of the rocking chair. The quiet had returned. This time it was real. This time it was earned. This was the peace he had been looking for all along.